The sun beat down on the northern Wyoming prairie like a red-hot knife. Dry winds swept across them, carrying dust and the clanking of barn door chains. In that vast field, there was a lonely log house, its walls faded with age and its roof tilted to one side where James Calder lived. Or rather, existed. James had been a soldier. He had walked through Gettysburg with a bullet grazing his left shoulder, and no one knew whether the wound was deeper in the flesh or in the heart. After the war, he had not returned home to Missouri, but had chosen this isolated place, Cinder Hollow, to bury his memories and live as if no one remembered him. Each day was spent in the same old routine, rising at dawn, carrying water from the back well, mending fences, in inmates, feeding horses, and sitting by the fire at night, rereading passages from his wife, Mary, who had died of malaria during the harsh winter 4 years earlier. James never spoke much. There was no one to talk to. The wind was his friend, the fire his companion, and silence. Wasser, one. That was what he took for granted. But that day, the silence was broken. A figure appeared on the red dusty trail silently, as if it had come out of thin air. It was a woman, with an earth-colored shawl around her shoulders, patched trousers, and her hands clutching the reins of a bony mule. Beside her was a child 6 or 7, with dark hair and sunburned cheeks. They walked as if each step was a struggle. James was fixing the hinges of the barn door when he heard the sound of hooves. He looked up, still holding the hammer. She said nothing as she approached. She stopped about 30 paces away. Her eyes were pale brown. Sunken, but not imploring. It's a long way, she said, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't used them in days. I'm not asking for shelter, just a corner of the barn to spend the night. I can work for a change. James looked at her, then at the child. It stood behind her, clutching the hem of her dress. Is it a girl or a boy? James asked. A boy. Sam and Tim. He nodded. The pen in the back. Empty? Not warm, but no wild animals. She nodded back, her hollow eyes blinking as if that was more than she had expected. Before it got dark, she cleared the dust from the pen, spreading the old blanket from the mule in a dry corner. Sam drank 2 bowlfuls of water and fell asleep before the sun set. The woman she introduced herself as Hattie Monroe did not sleep. She sat in the doorway, watching the glow of James's stove flicker through the open door. James did not invite her in, and she did not cross the threshold. They sat like that, each on their own side of the world, the fire in the middle. The next morning, James found the stables cleared, the wood piled neatly, and the wooden door at the back of the house, which had fallen off its hinges, secured with a nail she had hammered herself. She didn't ask. She just did. Sam followed James all morning, holding a bucket of water larger than himself. Silently but curiously, James found the boy thin, but strong. Something inside him for a long time unnamed stirred. When the sun rose, James left 2 baked potatoes near the stove, a salt shaker, and a slice of bacon. No words were exchanged. When he returned later in the afternoon, the food was gone, replaced by a clean, folded handkerchief on the porch. 3 days later, a strong wind blew. James was anchoring the roof of the stable when he saw Sam being blown over while carrying water. The colt ran toward him in a panic. James leaped over the fence, pulling the boy up just in time before his hooves crushed the ground beside him. Hattie ran out, white-faced, shaking as she hugged Sam. She looked up at James, and for the first time, her eyes were unguarded. Thank you, she said. 3 simple words, nothing more. That night, when James came home, a small loaf of bread was placed by the door. No noti, nem, no need bisuri darwin. He didn't eat it right away. He just sat, watching it in the quiet firelight. The dust still flew outside the window, but now he let it fly, not brushing it away, not closing the door, just letting it drift, like something changing, slowly but surely. The wind in the west never quite calmed. It might ease at night, it might change direction with the seasons, but it never stopped altogether. It was a reminder that this land was no place for the weak. Wyoming was unforgiving. It took people in, as long as they didn't expect it to be gentle. James Calder had learned that the hard way. In 1863, when the shots rang out at Gettysburg, he was only 21, hot-blooded, not yet sure what was worth living for and what was empty pride. By the time he returned, a bullet had left a scar on his left shoulder that lasted until his first winter where Mary, His young wife nursed him through his fevers, through his deliriums, calling out for his dead brothers. They had no children, not for want of trying, just for want of life. Mary died of pneumonia in a January snow. James did not return her body to Missouri. He wrapped her in a hand-embroidered wedding blanket, buried her under a pine tree behind the house, and erected a wooden tombstone with 3 words engraved on it. Loved. No last name, no year of birth, that was it. From then on, James shut himself off from the world. No friends, no letters, no church, no answer to knocks at the door. He retreated like a trapped animal, ready to growl if anyone came too close. Hattie Monroe had a scar, too, but not on her skin. She was born in eastern Kansas, where the sky was wide but the hearts were narrow. The eldest of 6 children, she learned to cook, and laugh at the right times. When her father married her off to a sheep farmer 20 years her senior, Hattie did not cry. She just looked between her fingers and nodded. The husband was Wilbur Monroe, not a violent man, but quiet and controlling. He would not let Hattie go to market alone, would not let her read anything except the Bible, would not let her talk to the neighbors without him. Every night he read aloud the verses that commanded wives to submit to their husbands in a monotone. Not angry, but cold as a January river. When Hattie was pregnant, Wilbur was happy, but when the baby was born and had hair unlike his father's, he became pensive, more and more annoyed. A week later, he was found dead in his bed, blue skin, mouth crooked, eyes still open. Hattie said he had a stroke. The doctors said it might have been poison. They found no medicine, but people didn't need proof. Just a whisper. Wilbur's family forbade her to return to town. They couldn't sue her, but no one welcomed her. Even her own parents disowned her. No one wants to have anything to do with a widow with a bad reputation. Her mother said through the half-open door. So Hattie went. She packed her things in an oilcloth bag, carried the baby out of the house, and didn't know where she was going. No one asked her name. She named it herself. Samuel, he who is heard by God. 5 years passed like that, moving from one shelter to another, working for hire, trading for food, sleeping in the stables, in the kitchen, even going 3 days without eating after being kicked out of the hut in the middle of a snowy night. Hattie Monroe was ignored, and sometimes cursed. She didn't defend herself. She just lived. Then she met James. James remembered her from the first time. He had been there for her brief trial, nothing of great consequence, just to bring water to the lawyer and write copies for the local minister. But the way she stood in the courtroom, not crying, not pleading, just looking straight at the accuser, had stayed with James. He had thought, she has no one, and now. All these years later, the woman had appeared at his barn door, with calloused hands and a child who looked exactly like her. It was a drizzling rain on Wednesday afternoon. James was carrying water from the well when he saw Sam reading a piece of paper. Not really, just pretending. The boy flipped through the damp pages, his eyes shining as if each letter was a window into another world. Can you read? James asked. Taking the initiative for the first time, Sam looked up. A little lost and ticket to remind. Where did you learn that? Mom taught me. James sat down on the log, smiling slightly, a rare one. Do you know how to read this, Cyrus? He drew a scribbled letter in the dirt. See, Cooper, Sam guessed. James laughed. Almost where witches, sarcasm. Hattie arrived a moment later. She stood at a distance, not interrupting, but when Sam ran toward her, showing off that she had red fence from an old piece of wood, James saw something in her eyes, not pride, but relief, as if she had seen her son still have a place as a normal child. That night, James knocked on the barn door. Hattie opened it. Sam was asleep. I have some cookies, leftovers. If you want them, he said, holding out the paper package. We are in. Hattie looked at it, then nodded. Thanks. A pause. I saw you in court. She looked at him, not defensively but cautiously. Can't help, he said, his eyes fixed on the spot of light on the ground. I'm sorry. Hattie didn't answer right away. Then she said, in a quieter voice. No one owes me anything. James said nothing more. He just nodded and turned away. But before he disappeared behind the pines, Hattie said quietly it was unclear whether to him or to herself. But I remember. And that's enough. We wave us. That night, James couldn't sleep. He stoked the firewood, took out Mary's old notebook, and read. In it, she'd written a sentence he'd forgotten. There are people you can't save, but you can give them a place to rest. The next morning, as the sun rose over the pines, James left an old child's coat once worn by a kid in the barracks he knew at the barn door. He wrote nothing. Didn't knock. When he returned, the coat was gone. In its place was a bundle of fragrant herbs tied with twine, placed by the stairs like a silent greeting. And from then on, they began to live close together, but without ties, like two people living side by side on the same land, facing the wind, the time and the wounds that no one else understood but themselves. In a land like Cinder Hollow, people don't say they love each other. There's no need. Love here does not come in flowers, cards, or sweet words that drift like cigarette smoke. It comes in simple acts: a coat left quietly on the stairs, a pair of boots mended quietly in the night, or a roof reinforced against the rain without anyone asking for it. James Calder did not think of himself as an easy person to get along with. His whole life had been a series of choices. Stay wiki Tuesday once. Endure. Be silent. But when Hattie Monroe and little Sam stopped at his stable, silence began to change its tone. No longer lonely, but something closer to peace. One autumn morning, when the fog still hung over the grass, James went out to the stable as usual. He stopped when he saw Hattie mending the reins of her mule. Sam was asleep on a pile of hay, his face buried in an old Bible, his mouth open to reveal a baby tooth that was about to fall out. Hattie looked up as James approached, but said nothing. The harness is too old, he remarked. It's still serviceable. James did not argue. He sat down beside her, took the needle from her hand, and began to thread new thread into the leather. Hattie tried to hold it, but then let go. They sat so close that their breaths, as thin as morning dew, could have touched, but there were no unnecessary words. 2 days later, James was cutting wood behind the barn when he heard a whistling sound. Not the wind, but something alive. When he turned one for an he saw Hattie and Sam facing a small but hungry wolf, its gray fur bristling, its eyes red, its teeth bared in waves. Sam stood rooted to the spot. Hattie raised her arms in front of her, trembling, but not retreating. James did not think he reacted. The bullet exploded in the mist, whistling past the beast's head and pinning it a few inches away. The shot did not kill. It chased. The wolf backed away, growling, and ran back into the woods as if it knew it had gone too far. When everything was quiet, Hattie still hadn't moved. It's okay, James said, walking slowly toward her. Sam clung to her mother's skirt, trembling, but Hattie's eyes weren't filled with fear. They were something deeper, more painful. Are you okay? Hattie nodded slightly. Then suddenly, without warning, she knelt down, took Sam in her arms and cried. No sound, no whimper, just tears that had been held back for too long. James didn't know what to do. He stood still. And then, without a word, he untied the scarf around his neck and handed it to her. She took it, her hands shaking. I thank you, she whispered. That evening, when James got home, a loaf of fresh bread was on the steps, along with a small jar of honey, clearly Hattie's rare saving. He picked it up, looked toward the barn. No one was there, but he knew kindness in this land often had no explanation, nor did it need it. They talked more in the days that followed, but still in quiet fragments. I fixed the leak in the roof, Hattie said one morning. Thanks. Sam can help you chop wood. He's good at it, only if I teach him how to avoid losing a finger. A fair deal. Slowly, things began to move, like ice melting slowly in the weak sunlight. One afternoon late in the month, James came home later than usual from mending the fence near the slope. When he opened the barn door, he saw a small thing sitting on the steps, a grass doll, woven from soft, dry fibers, wearing a dress of rags. One eye was a button, the other a dried corn kernel. James picked it up and turned it gently. AJ was sewn in red thread on the back of the doll. He knew it was Sam's doing, but it wasn't the boy's idea. That evening, Hattie came to his porch as the sun was setting. She didn't come in, just stood under the porch, holding a basket of white radishes and dried onions. I don't have much, she said. That's more than I've had all week. James said. They sat on the steps, the sunset stretching across the hills beyond. The shadows of the trees fell across the porch. creating patches of light and dark on the dry ground. James spoke after a moment of silence. "Are you going?" Hattie looked at him. "Longer than usual." Uh, uh, I don't know. It's the same everywhere." "It's not the same anywhere. Not if you choose to stay." She pursed her lips, then nodded very slightly, like an unspoken promise. That night, James put the hay doll on the table, next to Mary's old frame. He touched it lightly and whispered, "I wouldn't mind if there were more people." No one answered, but he knew the dust had begun to settle. Winter had come early that year, not with snow, but with a quiet chill that seeped into the bones, making every wooden door shrink and every rope in the stable harden to steel. The wind didn't blow as fiercely as in January, but whistled softly, like a warning that no one really listened to. James noticed it one Monday morning, when he noticed the geese had left earlier than usual. Sam asked why, but James didn't answer. He just looked up at the sky, a deep blue, cloudless, and went back to cleaning the woodshed. 3 days later, the past returned in human form. Pike arrived at noon, riding a shiny red horse, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low and his silver-heeled boots clicking steadily on the frozen ground. He needed no introduction. James knew him not from conversation, but from rumors and unspoken glances among frontier men. His full name was Jebediah Pike, the owner of one of the largest farms south of Cinder Hollow, a man of whom there was nothing he couldn't buy, except kindness. He had been behind several forced land sales, an unknown barn fire, and a rumor that he had a connection with the old county sheriff. And most important of all, he had been a cousin of Wilbur Monroe Hattie's dead husband. Hattie saw him from a distance. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together as if cut by the wind. James was hammering a fence post when he heard the sound of hooves, and when he turned, he saw Hattie standing as still as a statue, eyes unblinking, hands clutching the wooden bucket. Pike dismounted, brushing the dust off his coat as if he had a right to everything he saw. Well, he said loudly. "If this isn't Miss Monroe alive and well." James dropped his hammer and came forward. "Who are you?" Pike didn't even look at him. "I'm a close relative of her poor husband, who died in circumstances that are hard to call clear." Hattie said nothing. She just looked at him, her eyes cold, not afraid, but not trembling either. "I came up," Pike said. Turning to James, to remind you that she's not just a poor wandering widow. She's a debtor. And I have papers here to prove that she signed over a portion of her ancestral land to Wilbur before he died. James frowned. "This is my land." "You say so," Pike replied, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "But the court papers say I have a claim to wherever she resides as far as the Monroe property is concerned. She owns nothing here. She's a guest," James said, his voice slow and firm. Pike raised his eyebrows, as if surprised that this quiet man had dared to speak against him. "A guest." He turned to Hattie. "That's good. Because if you're not the landowner, you'll have to leave. Now?" "Go watch." "No," James said. "She's staying. And if you cross this fence again, I'll consider it trespassing." The air froze. Pike was not a pushover, but he wasn't stupid either. He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "Sure," he said. "But let me remind you, the laws of this country aren't written on paper. They're written in fire. Gunfire. Patricia in hearsay." He turned and mounted his horse. Before he left, he added, his voice hissing like wind through rusty nail holes, "I'll be back." James slept poorly that night. The door was double bolted. He kept the Winchester under the bed. Within reach, Scout Toronto, the old dog Sam had picked up, whined softly when the wind howled through the roof tiles. Hattie did not come out as usual. James knew she was awake. The small light in the stable still flickered late into the night. She was not afraid of the dark. She was afraid of the past in human clothes. 2 days later, the stable caught fire. It started with a burning smell that seeped into her sleep. Scout howled, and James sprang up, gun in hand. When he ran to the door, flames were licking the roof, orange and pink reflecting off the night sky. He shouted. Hattie emerged from the darkness, pulling Sam, who was still half asleep. They both ran to help. James put out the fire with his bare hands, pouring buckets of water from the pool behind the house. They couldn't save the roof, but they saved the mules. As the ashes smoldered, James found a small object glinting in the charred wood, a piece of silver buckle J. P. inscribed. Pike didn't need to speak. He just left a mark. The next morning, Surinanarkin warrantika. James didn't tell Hattie about the buckle. He knew she understood it. They just looked at each other. And Hattie nodded a nod of no complaint. Just acceptance. He won't stop, she said. No, James said, but neither will I. I'm praying for you. That afternoon, James rode into town. He didn't come to Pike. He didn't need to. Tinaken Chornasafum. He went to the only person who still had any say in the county's mud of power. Reverend Garrett, an old man, blind in one eye, who lived near the edge of the woods, but who was still a marriage contractor, a witness, and a man respected by the people. James didn't believe in God's word, but in reputation. I need you to be my witness, James said. After he had told the whole story, Garrett sat silent for a moment. Then he nodded. I know Pike. I've known him for a long time. He doesn't believe in the law, only in fear. She's not afraid anymore, James said. And I never have been. Garrett looked at him. What do you want to do? James tightened the brim of his hat. I want to get married. The ceremony was quiet. After dusk that day, in the parsonage, before a candle, no music, no flowery vows. Hattie wore an old brown cloth dress, her hair braided down her back. Sam stood beside her, holding James's shirt. You don't have to, Hattie whispered, her eyes tearing. I know, James said, but I want to do raise to, meeting. Garrett asked. Do you have a ring? James pulled out a dull silver ring, Mary's wedding band. Hattie hesitated. He didn't force her. She put it on, with both hands, as if she were afraid she wasn't worthy enough. On the way home, they didn't speak. The wind whistled through the pines, leaving the smell of sap and coming winter. Sam fell asleep on the mule. James held the reins. Hattie sat behind him, not holding him, but the warmth through her coat was enough to let him know she was staying. That night, James put an extra bed of straw in the house. No one talked about it. No need to say anything. But the next morning, when James got up to make coffee, he found 2 iron bowls beside the stove instead of 1. Pike returned that afternoon. Not alone. 2 men rode after him, one tall, with a beard and a pistol at his side, the other younger. But with his hand on the stock like someone who had never fired a real shot, James stepped onto the porch. His gun on his back. Hattie was behind him, her hair in a bun, her arm around Sam. You're out, Pike said, raising an eyebrow. Married, marrying a woman who's been charged with murder, interesting choice. She's my wife, James said. And you're on my property. Pike smiled, not hiding his malice. Where are the papers? James pulled out the marriage certificate, signed by Reverend Garrett. Pike glanced at it, disdainful. Congratulations. Then Menuwan, he said, turning his horse. But the war doesn't end on a piece of paper. As he walked away, James squeezed the railing until the wood cracked. Hattie put her hand on his. For the first time, she touched him first. Even we've just begun, she said. And James Hurrisurtsustuwan, the man who had believed in nothing but dust, just nodded for the first time. He believed that if anyone was worth trading for peace, it was the one who could live in silence without being silenced. The morning after James and Hattie signed their marriage contract, it was a light rain, a rare rain on the Wyoming prairie. Not persistent, not screaming, just a message from the heavens. Everything had changed. The smell of cornbread wafted through the kitchen. Sam was peeling apples. Scout lay under the table. Breathing evenly, Hattie quietly ladled cornmeal into the muffin pan. Not a word, as if she had lived here all her life. But James knew that this was the first time she had cooked in a kitchen that wasn't in exchange for a place to sleep. There was no such thing as a honeymoon here. No flowers, no white veil, only the faded silver ring she had not taken off. A reminder that she was no longer alone. Moving into the house was not a problem. Hattie and Sam had been living in the stables for weeks, and James's house was large enough, if not empty. What was going on outside was a problem. News traveled faster than the wind. That same afternoon, a postman from town arrived. A boy not yet 14, his face red as if he had been forced to do something he did not want to do. A letter from Mr. Durwashuranapsir Calder Armeni Warnanper, he said, not meeting James's eyes, his hand shaking as he handed over the folded piece of paper. James opened it. There were only 3 words. You are wrong. No signature. No punctuation. The black ink was scribbled, as if it had been scribbled with an old marker. James folded the letter and threw it into the fire. "What's the matter?" Hattie asked, more calmly than he expected. "Nothing to worry about." She looked at him, then nodded, without asking. But James knew she knew. She always knew without saying it. 3 days later, James was invited to a meeting at the town church, a gathering that everyone called civil. But he knew it was anything but civil. When he arrived, they were all there. Reverend Garrett, the general store owner, the new sheriff, and part. James wasn't surprised. He just sat down, silent. A woman stood up, Mrs. Dawson, Cheshire, a widow who lived near the main road, and said, "We're worried, Mard. Sir, Mr. Courtney, sir, called her about the impact, about your choice." James's lips curled. "Who's the impact? Straight, Gary, the community," she said. "The reputation of this town is safe." Pike said nothing. He just smiled as if he were not involved. Even though everyone else was sitting around turning away from him, she didn't kill her husband. James said, "I saw the trial." "Nobody said that," Pastor Garrett interjected, trying to keep his voice neutral. James tilted his head. "So what's the problem?" "That I married a woman who had been abandoned on unsubstantiated rumors." No one answered. "Or that I married without any of your permission." No one looked at him. Pike spoke, softly, like a chivalrous land salesman. "We just want to make sure you know she's not innocent. I have a civil record. She signed a promissory note for Wilbur Monroe. It's still valid. The law doesn't kill with her husband." James looked at him. "Is it real?" "So real that I have a copy notarized by the county clerk." James clasped his hands. "Then I'll see the county clerk. In person." On the way home, James said nothing. Scout walked beside him, tail tucked. Clouds gathered on the horizon. A cold rain was coming. Hattie waited on the porch. Sam was asleep. The fireplace was red hot. "What did they say?" she asked. James held out his hand. In his lap was a piece of paper, a summons from the county court, about a land claim involving Hattie and the Monroe heir Pike. "It's the law," James said. He took it to court. Hattie was not surprised. She asked, "Do you regret it?" James looked at her. No, no, because you got me into it." "Nuss," he insisted. She turned away, squeezing the ring on her finger. "I thought if I just left, no one would get involved. And now," she turned back. "Now I know, peace doesn't come from running away." That night, James rummaged through the old wooden chest in the attic. Inside it was a small box, a few things that belonged to Mary, an embroidered handkerchief, a piece of paper with soft handwriting, and a second wedding ring. He held it a long time. His hands trembled slightly. Then he put it back in the box. He closed the lid and tied the cloth. The next morning, the box was buried beside Mary's grave, a small hole, a candle, and a wordless goodbye. Hattie didn't ask why James was late that day. But when she saw him put his hands on the table, silent, she handed him a cup of tea. No sugar, as if she understood. "We have to go to the county court tomorrow," James said. "About the land. For honor." They set off at dawn the next day. This time no one hid. No one bowed. Sam stayed with Pastor Garrett. They rode together. Chill. James's hands on the reins, but his heart on the back, which was no longer his house. But their house, the county courthouse, was in Sweetwater, nearly 3 days' journey from Cinder Hollow. On the way, James told Hattie about Mary, about his old life, about why he hadn't left the prairie. "I didn't replace her," Hattie whispered. "I know, and I don't need your help." "I know." They said nothing more. But all night, in the little inn in the fields, Hattie held James's hand as she slept, the first time she had slept without dreaming of fire. The hearing in court was short. Pike was absent. He had sent a lawyer who had brought the debt papers. But the court found out. The original had no seal. The signature had been altered. The debt certificate was a forgery. James sat up straight. Hattie looked straight at the lawyer. "If you need someone to target again, target me, but don't use my son's name to keep me quiet." The judge didn't say anything definitive, but he did order a search of Pike's past land holdings. James knew this was the beginning of the end for him. On the way home, they didn't ride fast. They let the horse take its time. Hattie said, "When this is all over, I want to plant vegetables, tomatoes, beans, and sunflowers. I'll make a trellis." When they got home, Sam ran out to hug his mother. Scout barked happily. The smell of cornbread filled the porch. On the table, Another letter had been left undelivered. James opened it. Inside, it read, "If you don't win with guns, you win with time. I'm not backing down. I'm just waiting for you to get tired." James threw it on the fire. Then he looked at Hattie. "We won't be tired." And for the first time, smiled fully, not reserved, not timid. The smile of those who knew, though the war was not over. They were not alone. The snow fell on the 3rd day of December, earlier than usual. Not the gentle, slow drifts from the milky sky, but a white fury that covered the ground in a matter of hours. The wind whistled across the hills, slapping against the windows like a slap from nature. Without warning, without mercy, the prairie was silent, not the silence of peace, but of foreboding. James felt it when Scout began to walk around the house every night, sleepless, growling quietly. When the deer disappeared from the hills, when the east fence was cut, then reattached by a stranger, when the woodpile outside the barn was disturbed, though the door was locked, and when Sam, reading by the fire, looked up and asked, "Pa, if someone wanted to hurt you, could I hit them back?" James did not answer right away. He looked at the child. His face was thin, but his eyes were as hard as river pebbles. He knew the boy had heard. He had seen. He understood. "You don't have to hit me," James said. "Just stand still next to me. That's enough." That night, James spread more hay in the attic. Hattie stuffed more cloth into the cracks in the doors. Sam slept between the two adults, not out of fear, but out of cold. But James knew. He knew better than they thought. It snowed for 3 days, and on the 4th night he brought what James had prepared but couldn't stop. The first shot rang out around 1 in the morning. Not too close. Not too far enough for Scout to howl from the back door, then growl as if she'd waited her whole life for this moment. James jumped up. Hattie had put on her coat, pistol at her side, dagger tucked in her boot. She didn't ask, just nodded. Sam was shivering under the covers. Hattie hugged him. Down in the cellar. "Ituri was Sherman. Nhanin, remember. Mesa Uwarn," she whispered. He nodded. The trap door in the kitchen opened. Beneath was a small shelter James and Hattie had dug in the weeks after the barn fire, with blankets, candles, water, and 2 doors, one to the kitchen, one to the back of the house. "Don't leave until I call," James said. "Listen for the knock 3 times, come out. Twice wait, once hide." Sam swallowed, nodded. Hattie said nothing. But when James started to step forward, she took his hand. "I'm not going alone." James didn't want to. She was the one he wanted to keep out of the dark. But her gaze wasn't asking permission. It was making it clear. If he didn't let her come with him, she would come after. He nodded. They climbed onto the roof. Snow was knee-deep. James's eyes scanned the area. The southern pines were dimly lit. 3 figures on horseback were circling the edge of the fence like ghosts. One of them tall, left-handed, was Clem Hollis, Pike's henchman. James knew him from the Willow Creek campfire. The other was younger, holding the gun like a man who had never killed anyone. The third, James couldn't see his face, but he heard his voice. James called her, "Come out here, or I'll burn this ramshackle barn down and drag her out." Hattie hissed. He had no right to. James put his hand on her shoulder. "I know." He turned, looked into her eyes. "This isn't my house anymore. This is your house. I won't let it burn." The first bullet didn't come from James. Clem fired at the roof. It hit a wooden post. James didn't answer. He stood up, raised his Winchester. A single shot smashed the lantern hanging from the enemy's horse. The lights went out, and darkness returned. "Listen," James shouted. "I don't want to kill anyone, but you take one more step, I won't fire a warning shot again." Silence. Then another voice, not Pike's, not Clem's. "We have a warrant from the county. A warrant for confiscation for immigration violations." James laughed coldly. "Read the law. She's a citizen. My wife?" Silence again. The wind howled. Then bang! A bottle of gasoline was thrown toward the porch, flaring red. The wooden door caught fire. James jumped down, covering it with wet cloth. Hattie fired 2 shots, not aimed, but enough to send the thrower back. Screams. A man had slipped from his horse. "He's hit by snow," someone shouted. "Get back." Clem shouted, "Get back." James saw Pike's silhouette. turned on his horse, and shouted, "I'll be back." As the hoofbeats faded, Hattie still hadn't lowered her gun. James put his hand on the barrel and pushed down gently. "It's over." She looked at him, her eyes watering not because she was afraid, but because she hadn't run away after all. When they opened the cellar door, Sam rushed out and hugged her. "Did you really shoot?" Hattie nodded. "Did anyone die?" "No." "So you won?" She looked at James. "No." "Honey, Deresuranatun. You just survived." It was morning. Snow covered the prairie. The porch was scorched, but the house was still standing. James sat on the steps, his eyes dark, his gun beside him. Hattie brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to him. Sam played with Scout in the yard, building a snowman and putting James's old hat on her head. "How many more times do you think we'll do this?" she asked. James did not answer right away. Then he said, "As long as he thinks he can take what he does not deserve." But what was sorry, James looked at her. "Next time, I won't let you shoot." She smiled softly. "Next time, I'll hit you." In their eyes, snow was the only thing pure in this land. But that day, beneath the snow, blood dripped not of people, but of the past, being dug up and forced to be reburied properly. 4 days after the snowy night attack, 2 men rode into Cinder Hollow carrying something more important than guns, the seal of the federal government. They did not wear bright uniforms. They did not shout the law. But when they flashed the badge of the Sweetwater County clerk and said they were there to clarify the land ownership situation and false claims, no one dared to ask further questions. James leaned against the porch, one hand on a pillar, the other holding a cold cup of coffee. Hattie came out behind him, a shawl over her shoulders. Sam played with Scout in the garden, but kept glancing at the 2 strangers with a look of unconcern. One of them, Inspector Linwood, said bluntly, "We have a complaint against Pike for various fraudulent transactions. Forcible signing, and false proxies." James didn't ask who sent it. He knew. It was himself and Hattie, from the Sweetwater courthouse. "We need 2 people to come to town to sign affidavits." The other said, "And if necessary, to testify." James nodded. "We can go." The town was no longer silent. As James and Hattie rode down Main Street, windows were cracked. People looked, but no longer whispered. Some nodded, some didn't, but no one dared to turn away. The Sweetwater courthouse held a special hearing, not a full trial, but a prelude to holding Pike if there was enough evidence. When they entered the room, Pike was there, black suit, red tie, not a speck of snow on him as if he had come on the wind. He smiled when he saw Hattie. "Finally, you're back in the right place." The courtroom. James took her hand. She didn't shake. She just looked at him, not with fear, but with the eyes of someone who had survived him. The defense presented evidence. False debt documents, found with false seals and forged signatures. An anonymous witness testified that he had seen Pike forcing people to sign blank papers. A farmer testified, "He forced me to trade land for horses, and then there were no horses." Hattie stood up and gave her testimony about the night of the barn fire and the attack in the snow. When asked why she didn't leave to escape danger, she replied, "Because for the first time in my life, I have a roof over my head that wasn't built out of fear." Pike's lawyer countered, "There was no physical evidence of Pike being at the scene of the fire or the attack." James stood up, pulling out a scorched piece of cloth he'd found near the fence after the snowy night with the initials C. George, embroidered on it for Clem Hollis, Pike's henchman. "Turi Usha Sirimarman. We're not making this up," James said. "We survived." The court had not yet issued an arrest warrant, but Pike was banned from leaving Sweetwater and had to report to the office every week. The records were sealed pending a full investigation. When he left the room, he was no longer smiling. He looked at James, his eyes no longer arrogant, but with suppressed torment. On the way back, Sam asked, "Did you get him?" James didn't answer right away. Hattie said, No, we turn on to him. "Dad, the law will..." Sam frowned. "The law takes too long." James nodded. "But if I break the rules, I'll be like him." "A pretty question." The boy paused, then nodded. "Then I'll wait, but not close my eyes." Back home, James rebuilt the burned porch. Hattie patched Sam's coat. Scout barked happily when James came in, as if this time, she really believed, things would be all right. A week later, Inspector Linwood sent a letter. Pike was under further investigation in 3 neighboring counties. One involved a missing witness. One involved forgery. One involved bribery of the county clerk. James read the letter and said nothing. Hattie held her teacup, her eyes looking far away. Did we win? She asked. I don't know, but at least you're not alone. James looked at her. You never were. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Sam dozed. Svedetidi. Hattie knitted. James read a note Mary had written. If I lose you, don't close the door. Someone will need a porch. Like I did. James folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He knew it was no longer a will. It was a living, breathing truth in this very house. But when the snow melted, there would be mud. And what was coming would be more than just paperwork or a trial. Instead of returning to Cinder Hollow immediately after the hearing, James decided to stay in Sweetwater for the night. Not because he was afraid of Pike, but because he needed time. Both he and Hattie knew, when a wolf is cornered, it will bite anyone who stands near it, even the law. They rented a small room in the inn owned by Mrs. Monroe, a widow in her 50s, who lived off the proceeds of her jams and bitter coffee. When Hattie gave her name, Mrs. Monroe paused. You are? Hattie rose. Hattie nodded. The landlady was silent for a few seconds, then bowed her head. I testified against you at the trial. I said I saw you arguing with Wilbur that night, but I didn't see it. James stiffened, but Hattie held out her hand. I know. Everyone's afraid of him. I was too, Mrs. Monroe was tearful. I heard you're married. I pray God you don't have to leave again. That night, while Sam slept, James sat on the wooden chair by the window, looking down at the empty street. Hattie came over and put a coat over his shoulders. You should sleep for a while. No. Because you're afraid of Pike. James shook his head. Because you're afraid of what's behind Pike. She looked at him, frowning. He pulled a crumpled letter from his coat. The paper yellowed. It bore the seal of the federal government. 6 years ago, Mary, your ex-wife, was killed. They said it was a hunting accident. Hattie nodded slightly. He had mentioned Mary before, but actually, she was shot in the back, and the gun found at the scene had fingerprints belonging to a man named Thomas Laird, a land surveyor for Sweetwater County. You said Pike didn't kill Mary, but the man behind him, the guy who bought the cheap land after the family died, the Lairds. And Mary, she was a land clerk. Hattie paused. She found something. I think so. But after he died, all the land records from 1870 to 1876 disappeared from the archives. She sat down next to him. So, you didn't just take the plunge for me. James nodded. Not just for me, but for me. I'm not afraid to take the plunge. The next morning, when James walked into Inspector Linwood's office to submit more evidence, he greeted him with a strange look. Someone sent me this. On the table was a black envelope, unmarked. James opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, scribbled in charcoal. If Calder testifies, he won't leave Sweetwater in one piece. Someone owes Laird more than the land. James clutched the paper, looking up at Linwood. Do you believe in the system? Linwood didn't answer right away. Then he said, Son, I believe if there are men who are stubborn enough to stand up to him when he is wrong, and I think you are one of them. As they drove back to Cinder Hollow, the snow began to melt. The road was muddy, but the sun was shining. On horseback, Hattie asked, if they don't punish Pike, what will we do? James turned, his lips pressed together. If justice sleeps, I will wake him. And if he won't wake, he didn't smile, then I will drag him out if he has to crawl out on his knees. That night, James sat down to write a letter, not to his lawyer, nor to anyone in the government, but to his son Mary, the child he had never had the chance to raise, since he had been sent back east after his mother's death. The letter began, You never knew me, but you should know why I didn't die in vain. The snow melted quickly after James and Hattie returned to Cinder Hollow. Under the muddy puddles were hidden things, footprints, notes to win, and a past that had never rotted. James woke early each morning, looking toward Pine Hollow Hill, where the only road leading from Sweetwater into town was. Hattie made coffee and read over the notes, each one related to a name, a plot of land, or a forged debt. They robbed so many people, she said quietly. I know, James said, but not everyone is willing to take it back. 3 days later, James and Linwood headed for the old camp post, an old archive on the northern edge of Sweetwater, where notaries had been kept before the government switched to the more modern system of red letters. If Mary ever kept anything, it's here, Linwood said, opening the dusty wooden door. Inside, the smell of mold and old paper mingled. They turned the kerosene lamps from shelf to shelf. By noon, James stood before a rusted iron chest. He bent down, drew his dagger, and pried open the lid. Inside was a leather notebook, the first page in Mary's handwriting. Occasional excerpts to Sweetwater Library, in case of loss. The next page contained maps of the excerpts, and the names of the original owners, all now homeless or missing. Good heavens, Linwood whispered. James's hand trembled as he turned the last page. A copy of a refusal to sign a certificate of ownership from a name. Thomas Laird. At the bottom was a handwritten addition. If I die, it will not be an accident. Hattie stopped reading the notebook that evening. She picked up the old guitar James had left behind and played a few old notes. A rustic sound that hadn't been heard in the house since Mary died. Sam stood in the doorway, holding Scout. The cut on her leg was already dry. You can play, Mom? De French chanting. Just a few songs. Hattie laughed. Mommy used to sing backing vocals in church. James sat down beside her, listened to a few bars, and blurted out, "That's Mary's song." The three of them said nothing more. But in that moment, the music, the last thing left from the old world, brought them closer than any promise could have. A week later, they received word that Pike was no longer in Sweetwater. The surveillance order had been broken, and Laird, who had been the head of the land registry, had disappeared from the building. They're rounding up people. It was a Surik de Reina, Linwood said, shaking slightly with the telegram. And they won't be in court. James looked at Hattie. They'll come, not to burn down the barns this time. In the pale sunlight, Calder Ranch became a fortress. The townspeople began to show up, not saying much, not asking much. Old Ned from the blacksmith shop brought a dozen bags of sand. Landlady Monroe sent in dry bread and honey. A hunter left 2 ancient guns on the doorstep. Nobody said they were on your side, Hattie whispered, but they chose. Dersh's James nodded. And that's all you need. Scout hissed at the door that night. Hattie stood up, her eyes on the dark shape moving beyond the edge of the fence. They're coming. James cocked his gun. Tonight. We don't back down. A new moon was hidden behind a black cloud. There was no snow, but it was cold enough to feel death in every breath. James stood on the porch, his arms around his Winchester. Hattie was downstairs, next to Sam and Scout. She wore a short brown coat and James's trousers, the belt tied neatly around her waist. Over her shoulder, a double-barreled shotgun loaded with bullets. No one said anything. There was no need. The darkness in the distance moved. From the edge of the hill, lanterns flickered like animal eyes. 6, 7, then 10. Pike went first. Wolfskin cloaks, black hats, Washimwawan. Behind them were the henchmen, some of them dressed as land agents, but with guns instead of maps. They stopped at the fence. One shouted, "By order of the Sweetwater authorities, you are trespassing on disputed public land." James stepped out from the porch, empty-handed, his voice deep but resonant. "I have the original citation, signed by Mary Calder, filed at Old Kent Post enough to make this eviction order a piece of junk." Pike sneered. "I didn't come here for the paper." The first bullet whizzed across the roof of the stable. There was a crack of wood, and flames leaped from the piled straw. James shouted, "Sam, get behind the stone wall." Hattie took her son inside and locked the cellar door. Scout clawed at the ground, hissing in alarm. James fired the first shot. One of the torchbearers fell. The flames spread to his coat. His screams burned the night. The gunfight broke out. Pike and his men rushed through the fence. James hid behind the water tank, firing a shot that took out 2 of them. But then he heard the glass shattering behind him. A man climbed over the roof. Hattie didn't hesitate. She spun around, fired straight through the window. The man fell, blood staining the white wall. A man sneaked in from the stable. Scout lunged forward, biting his leg, but was kicked away. Sam screamed, picked up a rock and smashed it into the man's head, then ran back to James. Patun. James pulled his son in, shielding him with his body. A bullet grazed his shoulder. It hurt, but he stood. Another man tried to finish James off from behind, but before the trigger could be pulled, the bullet came straight from far away, right through the assassin's forehead. From the bushes behind him, Inspector Linwood stepped out, rifle in hand. his jacket muddy. Did I get there in time? James gasped, nodding. Just in time to save my life. Linwood threw a roll of paper onto the stone table beside James. It contained a federal warrant for the arrest of Pike and Thomas Laird, based on evidence from Mary's ledger and the testimony of several new witnesses. You have no business here, Pike shouted. Linwood stepped forward. The state of Wyoming has given federal jurisdiction. This is a multi-district land corruption case, and I have a living witness. Out of the shadows, Mrs. Monroe emerged, her hands shaking as she held a copy of a letter Hattie had written when she was wrongly convicted. I will not be silent. The henchmen retreated not because they had lost, but because they were no longer protected. Pike was handcuffed. He still managed to scream. Do you think the court will believe a woman, a widow, in a rundown town? James looked at him, his eyes no longer angry. But understanding the tragedy of the loser, the court may not, but history will. When the fire was out, mud filled the yard. Blood covered the door. Hattie bandaged James's wound. Sam held Scout. The dog was still alive, but trembling. The family sat on the porch. Under the dim light, James whispered, Tonight, none of us die. Hattie squeezed his hand. And from tomorrow, we live for real. 3 days after the battle. The smell of smoke had not yet cleared from the air of Cinder Hollow. People began to come to Calder Ranch as if in a ritual of atonement. No one told them, but one by one they appeared, some carrying nails, some carrying wood, some just standing there silently, then bowing their heads and placing bundles of hay next to the charred stable. James didn't ask why. He just bowed his head in thanks. Scout lay dozing on the porch, her leg wrapped in bandages. Sam covered her with a blanket every morning, more carefully than he had ever done his homework. One night, James found his son whispering something in the dog's ear, as if sharing secrets the adults didn't understand. On Wednesday morning, James climbed the western hill to a lone oak tree overlooking the valley. He carried a small wooden box. In it were Mary's letter, the original map, and a strand of hair from her wedding day. He buried the box under the oak roots, then set up a small wooden plaque. Here lives someone who dared to tell the truth, even if it cost her life. When he turned away, he saw Hattie standing there, holding a bunch of wildflowers. Aren't you going to let me say goodbye to her? James chuckled. I've lived for her, many times. They laid flowers by the tree, then left, holding hands. The town had an informal community meeting in front of the town hall. For the first time in years, Pike's name was spoken without whispers. They discussed countersuits, reclaiming their land, clearing their debts. The grocer de Rios Pinper, who had feared eviction, stood up first. If Calder can keep his land, I can keep my store. Then Mrs. Sarnesh Monroe, if Hattie Rose can shoot a trespasser to protect her son and her land, I can say what I saw and feared for so long. The last to stand was the Dillon girl, a 12-year-old with blonde hair. She said, my mother says the good guys don't always win, but this time it looks like they've won. The crowd applauded. That afternoon, Hattie and Sam went to the market. When they returned, they found James standing in front of the barn wall, the one that had been burned, holding a piece of wood with words engraved on it. Sam ran over and read aloud. Calder Ranch. Hattie put her hand on his shoulder. Son Citurna. We need a new nameplate. No need, James said, holding out the old piece of wood. The old one will work. It just needs someone to set a fire around it. That evening, they ate their first meal on the porch, under the oil lamp and the starry sky. No one spoke for several minutes. They just ate, breathed, and knew that for the first time in a long time, they didn't have to run. Sam suddenly asked, Are there ghosts? James laughed. Why do you ask? Because last night I dreamed about Mary. She didn't say anything, just nodded and walked toward the oak tree. I think, maybe she's not gone. James looked at Hattie. She didn't smile. She nodded, as if she truly believed it. Some people go, but they leave a light behind, like lamps on the roadside for those who come after them. A week later, the letter arrived. Pike was in the Sweetwater Detention Center, awaiting trial on 7 federal charges of fraud, trespassing on public land, impersonating a public official, and obstructing justice. Thomas Laird, the ringleader, was arrested in Kansas, trying to cross the Colorado border with false papers. He would be brought back for trial with him. Inspector Linwood sent a handwritten note under the main document. Justice is late, but it comes on the feet of those who never sit still. The next month, Calder Ranch was reborn. James rebuilt the fence. Hattie runs reading classes for the daughters of nearby families. Children who were kept out of school because their parents didn't have legal land titles. Scout walks with a limp, but she guards the barn like a warrior. Sam began to write down what happened. He wanted to write a book. The name is The Father Who Had Two Lives. He said, "Why two lives?" James asked. "Because once, I lost my wife and lived in silence. The second time, I found my voice again, without screaming." James looked at his son, then turned to Hattie. She smiled. "If you write a book, then all that we endured will not have been wasted." On the last evening of May, the three of them sat on the porch. The sky was clear. The wind was light. The moonlight shone through the mountainside, creating a long streak of light like a silver path in the wilderness. James stroked Hattie's hair, his voice hoarse. "If tomorrow someone comes and asks why I still cling to this land, what will you say?" Hattie looked into the distance. "I would say, because someone once said, if you close the door, you won't hear the horse coming home." James smiled, and in the distance, a real wild horse ran over the hill, its hooves beating the ground like a little drum of peace. The darkness was no longer scary, because now they saw the real dawn, not just light, but the right to live on. And when the dust settles, what remained was not ashes, but a porch, a farm, rare cuniboid, and three people, living, loving, and no longer afraid of anyone.